Greetings. In late spring of 399 BC, the eminent philosopher Socrates, after drinking a cup of poison, as sentenced by the Athenian jury, departed to the other world. By their decision, the Athenians killed one of the most famous Hellenes, the founder of classical Greek philosophy. How could this happen? How could the Athenians make such a decision, one that they soon regretted? Socrates was born in Athens in 469 BC to the family of the sculptor Sophroniscus and the midwife Phaenarete. He inherited his father's profession and was a sculptor for some time. One of Socrates' known works is the Charites, the three goddesses of joy and life, which were placed in front of the Acropolis. Socrates' family was neither wealthy nor poor. In his youth, he participated in several military campaigns and served in the army as a hoplite, a heavily armed soldier. In the Greek army, soldiers were required to purchase their own equipment, and the equipment of a hoplite was expensive, affordable only to relatively well-off citizens. The poorest citizens served as peltasts, whose entire armament consisted of a wicker shield called a pelta and a few javelins. It is said that Socrates served with great distinction and, during one battle, carried a wounded comrade off the battlefield, saving his life. Ancient depictions present him as snub-nosed, bald, with a large mouth, bulging eyes, and thick lips. An Eastern mage named Zopyrus, who arrived in Athens, claimed he could tell a person's character by their appearance. When he was shown Socrates, he assessed him as an intellectually undeveloped, lustful, and greedy person. The philosopher's students began to ridicule the foreign guest, finding this description utterly inaccurate. Socrates, however, unlike his students, acknowledged the assessment as accurate, since these vices had indeed been his in his youth. Nevertheless, through the practice of philosophy, he managed to overcome these flaws. I cannot say with certainty if Cicero mentioned a real event, as this description strongly resembles an illustration of one of Socrates' most important maxims. A person becomes who they are through spiritual education, and innate qualities can be changed. This prophecy is somewhat ambiguous. Most researchers believe that this event occurred before Socrates became widely known, likely before 431 BC. This was the year the Peloponnesian War began, lasting until 404 BC, and during the war, communication between Athens and Delphi was quite difficult. Why would the oracle name a relatively unknown sophist as the wisest figure? Moreover, Chaerephon did not ask who among the Hellenes was the wisest, as the Pythia might have mentioned a completely different name. Instead, he cunningly asked, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" So, let's accept the story as it is described. The oracle's response, as it is said, bewildered Socrates. He did not consider himself wise at all, and one of his favorite sayings was, "I know that I know nothing." He called himself not a wise man, sophist, but a lover of wisdom, a philosopher. Be that as it may, the Pythia's answer prompted Socrates to search for a truly wise person, whom he vainly sought among statesmen, poets, and even craftsmen. As a result, he dedicated himself entirely to philosophy and gained many students. His contribution to the development of philosophical thought is known as the Socratic turn in philosophy, and because of this, all ancient philosophy is divided into pre-Socratic and post-Socratic periods. The essence of this shift lies in turning philosophical reflections away from natural philosophy and cosmological issues towards the theme of the human being, with the main maxim of his teaching being, "Know thyself." Philosophy, according to Socrates, is the knowledge of what is good and evil. Good is the knowledge of truth, while ignorance is evil. It was Socrates who first applied the dialectical method. The term dialectic comes from the word dialogue, and for Socrates, dialogue was the primary method of seeking truth. Socrates never wrote down his thoughts. Everything was conveyed through live dialogue. Therefore, everything we know about him has come to us in the form of records by his contemporaries and students, among which Plato's Apology of Socrates and Xenophon's Memorabilia stand out. The problem is that in these records, Socrates' teachings are presented differently, and we do not know which ideas attributed to Socrates actually belonged to him, and which thoughts and statements were put into his mouth by the authors of the descriptions. Thus, it is impossible to determine what Socrates was truly like, and the problem of searching for the real Socrates has been named the Socratic question, which, it seems, remains unresolved to this day. However, returning to the description of Socrates' life, engaging in philosophy did not bring him any substantial income, but it occupied all of Socrates' free time, leaving no room for other pursuits to earn a living. His lifestyle as a philosopher changed accordingly. Now he completely embodied the image of the poor sage. During this period, he lived in poverty, wore rough clothing, and ate whatever he could find. He explained, "I eat to live, while others live to eat." He also said, "They say the gods have no needs. Therefore, the less one needs, the more one resembles a god." Walking through the marketplace, he would remark, "How pleasant it is that there are so many things I can do without." In 423 B.C., Socrates married a woman named Xanthippe, who came from a fairly wealthy family. At least, it is known that her father was a musician, and musicians in ancient Athens were not destitute. They had 3 sons together, but Xanthippe became famous in history for her contentious nature. In fact, her name became synonymous with a quarrelsome wife. Understandably, a woman far removed from philosophy could not have been pleased with Socrates spending his time in conversations with students on the streets and in public squares. The responsibility for their children and household fell entirely on her, leading to constant arguments and insults, which Socrates endured with philosophical calmness. People sent him gifts which he refused. Xanthippe would get angry and scold him. He would explain, "If we took everything that was given to us, they would give us nothing, even if we asked." Xanthippe would reproach him for his poverty, to which he replied, "What do people say? If they are wise, it doesn't matter to them. If they are foolish, it doesn't matter to us." Xanthippe complained that she had nothing to wear to see a festive procession. He replied, "It seems you are more concerned about showing yourself to people than seeing them." She would curse at him. He would smile. She would splash water on him. He would shake it off and say, "That's how it always is with my Xanthippe. First thunder, then rain." The outcome of Socrates' married life led him to conclude that a man needs to marry. If he is fortunate and finds a good wife, he will be happy. If not, he will become a philosopher. Before proceeding further, it is important to mention one of the most distinctive features of Socrates' thinking. Sometimes the philosopher would fall silent in the midst of conversation, cease to move, see or hear anything. He would immerse himself in thought. Once, he stood this way in a single tunic for an entire night. When later asked what had happened to him, he replied, "I was listening to my inner voice." In literature, this voice is referred to as the genius. more often Daimonion, from the Greek divine, or Socrates Daimon. According to Plato's account, it was a kind of divine voice that guided Socrates towards what is good. Sometimes the daemon would warn him against actions of significant political importance. For instance, allegedly obeying this voice, Socrates opposed the organization of the ill-fated Sicilian expedition, which ended in complete failure and Athens's defeat. At other times, the advice concerned trivial matters. For example, he was walking with his disciples towards the marketplace when the daimon told him, "Do not go down this street." He chose another route. Most of his followers followed him, but some, mocking the daemon's unusual intervention in such a minor matter, continued along the original path. As they passed the Street of Sculptors by the courthouse, a tightly packed herd of muddy pigs rushed towards them. There was no way to avoid them, so some were knocked over by the pigs, while others were splattered with mud from head to toe. Early Christian writer Tertullian perceived the daemon as something satanic, whereas Aurelius Augustine believed that Socrates had a guardian angel by his side. In Athens, Socrates was initially regarded as a harmless eccentric, but gradually a growing number of people began to view him very negatively. Socrates had refined his method of dialectical argumentation to such an extent that he became intimidating, and many, frustrated after conversations with him, wanted nothing more to do with him. A significant role in shaping the negative image of Socrates was played by Aristophanes' comedy Clouds, where Socrates was portrayed as the main negative character. The comedy was presented at the Dionysia festival in the spring of 423 BC. On Socrates' house hung a sign saying, "The Thinking Place," where he rocked in a hammock under the ceiling to be closer to the sky. Socrates pondered the mysteries of the universe, such as whether the length of a flea's jump, and prayed to the clouds. The clouds were new gods who could assume any form and thundered as loudly as Zeus. How did they thunder? Just like your stomach rumbles, so it rumbles in the clouds, and that's called thunder. The comedic effect was achieved through a combination of invention and real details. According to Aristophanes, Socrates often visited the gymnasia, palaestrae, allegedly to steal cloaks from the visitors. It was well known that Socrates had the habit of freezing in place during his contemplations. According to Aristophanes, during one of these moments of contemplation, a lizard defecated in his mouth. The comedy concludes with a call to punish the philosophers for dishonoring the gods. The Athenians laughed and looked at the real Socrates. He stood up to be more visible and calmly endured the entire performance. Despite the laughter, the Athenians awarded the comedy third place, which for an Aristophanic comedy was considered a failure. In the spring of 399 BC, a certain Miletus brought a public lawsuit against Socrates, who appeared before the court. This Miletus was a tragic poet, quite unsuccessful in his verse-making, never having been awarded a victory wreath, and was angered by the younger generation. Supporting the lawsuit were Anytus and Lycon. Lycon was an orator, equally hungry for fame, but lacking it. A completely different figure was Anytus, who clearly acted as the main shadow accuser of Socrates. He was wealthy, owned tanneries, and led the Democratic Party. He adhered to the traditional values of Athenian democracy. Socrates was charged with the following accusations. Socrates is accused of not recognizing the gods recognized by the city and introducing other new gods. He is also accused of corrupting the youth. The requested punishment is death. The primary focus of the first accusation was Socrates' famous Daimonion. Anytus and his associates constructed a scheme. Socrates believes in his Daimonion. Therefore, he does not believe in the universally recognized gods. The scheme, in principle, was not substantiated by any evidence, but outwardly it sounded menacing and convincing. The second accusation was based on the fact that three well-known disciples of Socrates, Alcibiades, Critias, and Charites, had brought many troubles to the city. During the war with Sparta, Alcibiades defected to the enemy's side and was condemned in absentia in his homeland. Critias and Charites were members of the 30 tyrants who ruled Athens in 404, 403 BC, and were overthrown by the people in a rebellion that restored democracy. The circumstance that most other disciples of Socrates were perfectly law-abiding citizens was not taken into consideration. Then, during the proceedings, two more accusations arose. The first was quite astonishing. Socrates was accused of disrespecting the great Greek literature and criticizing the great poets, especially Homer and Hesiod. The second accusation, which also periodically surfaced, was that Socrates was deemed an enemy of democracy and a bad citizen. The first accusation was practically unfounded. According to Plato's Apology, Socrates considered both poets to be geniuses. That he was not the worst citizen was demonstrated by his behavior in the military. As for the accusation that Socrates was an enemy of democracy, there was some truth in it. Indeed, Socrates disliked certain aspects of the existing Athenian system, particularly those we would describe as ochlocratic. Any citizen had the right of legislative initiative, and sometimes such absurd bills were proposed that some of them even became laws, which makes one wonder how such decisions could be made with sound mind and memory. One can recall, for instance, the absurd decision to organize the ill-fated Sicilian expedition, as I have mentioned before. Additionally, Socrates criticized the Athenian electoral system. The issue was that only strategoi and nomothetai responsible for finances were elected openly. All others were chosen by lot. Socrates once expressed that officials chosen by lot would inherently be incompetent. Moreover, the philosopher's own life did not conform well to the traditional values of the city-state system. As for the trial process, here I'll digress a bit from the story of Socrates to characterize the Athenian judicial system. The supreme judicial body in the Athenian state was the jury court, Helieia, consisting of 6,000 people, 5,000 active members and 1,000 reserves, elected annually. For its work, Helieia was divided into dicasteries, departments of several hundred people, which handled individual cases. Less significant cases were heard by panels of 201 or 301 judges. Perhaps it's clear why the number of judges is odd, to avoid indecisiveness in case of a tie. Most trials were heard by panels of 501 people, although for more important cases, larger panels could be convened, and in exceptional cases, the entire jury. In my opinion, it's a very good system, resistant to corruption. Try bribing 500 people. However, even the best can falter, and, in Socrates' case, Helieia did not shine. So, Socrates' case was heard by a panel consisting of 501 judges. The process also had its peculiarities. For crimes where the punishment was clearly defined, a single trial was sufficient, which determined the defendant's guilt and the punishment. However, for most crimes where the punishment was not predetermined, the process proceeded in two stages. The first stage discussed the question of the defendant's guilt, and the second stage determined the punishment if the verdict was guilty. There were 2 rounds of arguments and 2 rounds of voting. Since the process in ancient Athens was adversarial, in the second stage the judges had to choose between two options, the one proposed by the accuser or the one proposed by the defendant. Socrates' trial proceeded in two stages. In the first stage, the question of Socrates' guilt was examined. According to popular opinion, if Socrates had hired an experienced legal orator, they would have easily dismantled all the prosecution's arguments, and that would have been the end of it. But Socrates defended himself and spoke mainly on philosophical topics, not always understandable to most judges. Therefore, the verdict was clear: guilty. However, the situation was not catastrophic for Socrates. He was found guilty by 281 votes to 220, which meant the judges were undecided and unlikely to impose a death sentence in the next trial. Everyone expected Socrates to behave traditionally. He should have bowed his head, asked for forgiveness, shed tears, all against the backdrop of his weeping wife and children. Then, the repentant defendant would propose his own punishment, which he deserved in his own eyes, preferably harsher, so that the judges would believe in the defendant's repentance. And Socrates, he forbade Xanthippe and his sons from appearing in court, and they remained at home. In his speech he said, "Citizens of Athens, how can I propose a punishment for myself if I believe I am not guilty of anything? I even think that I am beneficial to the state by not allowing your minds to fall into lethargy with my conversations, and I trouble them like a gadfly troubling a fat and lazy horse. Therefore, I would propose not a punishment for myself, but a reward, perhaps, for example, dinner at public expense, because, after all, I am a poor man." In other words, according to the accused, he deserved not punishment, but the highest honor of Athens, a free dinner at the Prytaneum, where officials and honored citizens dined. In the end, 360 judges voted for the death penalty, while 141 voted against. How to explain Socrates' bizarre behavior in court? The only coherent explanation is that Socrates himself wanted to die. Xenophon relayed the memories of one of Socrates' students, Hermogenes. He attempted to reason with his teacher, trying to explain that innocence does not guarantee acquittal. In response to these arguments, Socrates said that he himself understood the reality of the situation, but his daimonion believed it was better for him to die. Friedrich Nietzsche succinctly summarized Socrates' trial and condemnation in his characteristic style. Socrates wanted to die, not Athens to him. He himself gave himself the cup of poison. He compelled Athens to give him this cup. However, returning to our story, Socrates' execution did not occur immediately. The annual voyage of the sacred ship to the temple of Apollo on the island of Delos from Athens meant that the death penalty was suspended while the ship was at sea with its sacred offerings. Friends suggested he escape from prison. He said, "Why? To break the law and truly deserve punishment? And where to? Is there any place where people do not die?" They said to him, "But it is painful to see you suffer undeservedly." He replied, "Would you prefer it to be deservedly?" They asked him, "How should we bury you?" He replied, "You have not listened well if you say this. You will bury not me, but my dead body." In Athens, he was executed by being forced to drink poison. His death was described by Plato in the dialogue Phaedo. When the cup was handed to Socrates, he drank it all. His friends cried, and he said, "Calm yourselves, and be brave. It is only fitting to die well." His body grew cold. He lay down. When the cold reached his heart, he said, "We owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay it." These were his last words. What did his words mean? Why was it necessary to sacrifice to the god of medicine and healing, Asclepius? Perhaps Socrates viewed death as the beginning of a new life, healing from the frailties of old age. But these words, if not invented by Plato, Socrates clearly said for posterity even at that moment, defending one of his theses. The tragic end of Socrates gave his entire life, his words and deeds, his teaching and personality, an enduring attractiveness framed by the Socratic aura of high truth. Soon after Socrates' execution, the Athenians, repenting of their actions, considering themselves misled, sentenced Meletus to death and the other accusers to exile. The famous sculptor Lysippus created a bust of Socrates. And the philosopher of the 3rd century, Diogenes Laertius, dedicated an epigram to Socrates. Drink nectar on Olympus, O Socrates. The gods declared you wise beyond measure, while your fellow Athenians, offering you poison, drank it themselves from your very lips. Thus the story of Socrates is concluded. Goodbye.